The neighborhood I grew up in had a name for guys like me. They called it "still figuring it out," which sounds generous until you hear the way my brother said it at Thanksgiving dinner, 11 years in a row, loud enough for everyone at the table to turn and look. My name is Conrad. I'm 54 years old. I have a brother named Elliot who is 6 years younger than me and has been announcing my failure since before I had any. That's the thing about family. They build a story about you early, and then they spend the rest of their lives trying to make sure you stay in it. The house where we grew up was in Dayton, Ohio. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a backyard that flooded every spring. My parents were practical people who didn't talk much about feelings, but showed up for every school event, every game, every graduation. They were good parents. Quiet, the kind of people who saved receipts and never paid full price for anything. Elliot was the charming one. I don't say that bitterly. He genuinely was. He walked into rooms the way some people walk into rooms, like the lights got slightly brighter, he told jokes that landed, he remembered birthdays. He called Mom every Sunday until she died, and he cried at the funeral in a way that made people want to hug him. I was the other one. I wasn't unfriendly. I wasn't cold. I just didn't perform. When something good happened to me, I tended to keep it to myself, not out of strategy, just out of habit. My mother used to say I came out of the womb already thinking. My father would laugh when she said it. Elliot would roll his eyes. We weren't close growing up, but we were brothers. There's a difference. After high school, I went to Ohio State, studied accounting, graduated with decent grades and no particular fanfare. Elliot went to a smaller school and a partial baseball scholarship, came back talking about making it big, and proceeded to spend his 20s working a series of sales jobs that he described as positioning himself for something larger. I spent my 20s doing the opposite of positioning. I took a job with a mid-sized construction firm in Columbus, doing their books, moved into a small apartment off Fifth Avenue, and started learning every part of the business I could from the edges of whatever room I was allowed in. I wasn't glamorous. I wasn't a story. I was just someone who showed up and paid attention. By the time I was 32, I had saved enough to buy a small stake in a struggling property management company in central Ohio with a man named Dwight, who was 20 years older than me and had the kind of instincts about buildings that I had about numbers. We made a good team. He saw what was broken. I figured out what it would cost to fix it, what we could charge, whether the math worked. For 3 years, it was hard. I mean that sincerely. There were quarters where we made payroll by the thinnest margin. There was a winter where I ate soup from a can most nights, not because I was being frugal, but because it was genuinely what I could afford. I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents. Not Elliot. It wasn't pride exactly. I think I just didn't want to hear what would happen if I admitted how bad things were. I'd watched enough people get talked out of difficult things by people who loved them, and I didn't want that. I wanted to find out for myself whether this could work. It worked. By the time I turned 40, the company had expanded to 4 markets in Ohio, 2 in Indiana, and 1 small operation in western Kentucky. We weren't a big company, but we were a good one. Profitable. Stable. The kind of company that didn't make news but paid its employees well and still had half a dozen properties it had held for 15 years without selling. I bought a house in Dublin, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus. Nothing flashy, a 4-bedroom craftsman on a quiet street with good schools. I'd met my wife, Nora, at a conference 8 years earlier. She was a real estate attorney, would come to do a panel on landlord liability, and ended up staying to argue with me afterward about a contract clause I thought was unenforceable. She was right. We had dinner that night, and I knew by dessert that she was the smartest person I'd sat across from in years. We got married 2 years later at a small ceremony in Vermont. Her family came. Mine didn't, because I didn't tell them, not a deliberate exclusion. I sent a note to my parents and Elliot 2 weeks before saying I was getting married and that I wasn't doing a big thing, just the 2 of us and her family, and that I hoped they understood. My mother called. She was hurt. I explained as best I could that this was just who I was, someone who keeps the big moments close, not because I'm hiding them, but because I don't know how to perform them for an audience. She said she understood, but I don't think she fully did. She came to visit us in Columbus 6 months later, and by the time she left, she loved Nora, which was all I needed. My father never said much about it. He shook Nora's hand when he met her, squeezed her shoulder and said, "Good." That was enough. Elliot found out we were married when my mother told him. He texted me. Congrats, I guess. A little weird that you didn't tell anyone. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't start a longer conversation I didn't want to have. By the time I was 52, Nora and I had 2 kids, our daughter Abby, who was 17 and studying for the SAT, and our son James, who was 14 and obsessed with building computers. Nora had scaled back her practice to part-time when Abby was born and had spent the past several years doing occasional consulting work, mostly because she liked staying sharp, not because we needed the income. We had a good life, genuinely good, not a life that looked impressive from the outside because we didn't make it look like anything from the outside. We drove ordinary cars. We didn't post on social media. Our house was comfortable but not a statement. Nora liked to say that real contentment doesn't need an audience. I'd always agreed, but I'd never said it out loud to my family. Which is probably how I ended up sitting at my sister-in-law's kitchen table in Dayton the Saturday before Christmas, listening to Elliot tell the room what was wrong with my life. Elliot's wife Pam hosted Christmas every year. This had been true for the past decade. Their house was a large colonial in a good part of Dayton. 4-car garage, professional landscaping, a kitchen that had been renovated twice. Elliot had done well for himself in the end, running a regional franchise operation selling outdoor furniture. He didn't talk about money so much as he talked around it, pointing out what things cost, how he negotiated something, what the square footage was. He was proud of what he built, and honestly, he should have been. He worked for it, but somewhere along the way, the comparison had become his language. Not with strangers, with me. It had started as jokes when we were in our 30s, gentle ribbing about the fact that I'd never bought a new car, that I'd shown up to a 4th of July barbecue in khakis, that I didn't have a LinkedIn profile. I laughed it off. It wasn't worth addressing. Then it became something else. By the time I was in my 40s, the jokes had turned sharper. There were comments at family dinners about my quiet little life, about how I seemed content just getting by, about how some people needed excitement and some people just needed a routine. I still didn't say anything, and I understood, on some level, why that made it worse. My silence looked like admission. That Christmas, Pam had made a beautiful dinner. Turkey and 3 sides, a pie from the bakery downtown, a sparkling cider for a mother who didn't drink. There were about 14 people around the table. Cousins I hadn't seen in a few years, Elliot's in-laws, their 2 teenage sons who were both on their phones. Elliot was talking about his newest location, a franchise in Clearwater, Florida. He'd flown down twice to scope it out. He described the hotel room, the weather, the restaurant where he'd had dinner on the company card. He was good at describing things. People were engaged. Then he looked at me. "Conrad, you ever get out of Columbus anymore?" "Sometimes," I said. "Where'd you go last time?" "Vermont, in October." He nodded slowly, the way he did when he was setting something up. "Just you? Little solo retreat?" I didn't answer that. I picked up my water glass. "I worry about you sometimes, man," he said. "You've been on your own a long time. It's okay to admit when something isn't working. You can pivot, you know. You're at 53 now." "54, I said. 54. He paused and looked around the table like he was checking to see who was listening, and everyone was. 54 years old, never been married, no kids, still in the same apartment in Columbus I've been hearing about for 20 years. I say this out of love, Conrad. At some point you have to ask yourself what you're building." The table was quiet. His mother-in-law stared at her plate. One of his sons looked up from his phone for the first time all meal. I set down my fork. Not dramatically, I just set it down, folded my napkin, and stood up. "I'm going to get some air," I said. I walked through the kitchen, out the back door, and stood on Pam's deck in the December cold for about 10 minutes. The sky was clear. I could see the neighbors' Christmas lights through the fence line. I wasn't angry, exactly. I was something quieter than that. I was tangry, exactly. I was something quieter than that. I wasn't going to correct him. Not there. Not like that. Not in front of his in-laws and his sons and the cousins who barely knew me. There was nothing to gain from it. Whatever I said would either be dismissed or turn into a scene. And I didn't want a scene. I went back inside, finished dinner, helped Pam carry dishes to the sink, and left at 9. On the drive home, I called Nora. "How was it?" she asked. Same as always, I said. She didn't push. She knew what that meant. I want to be honest about something. I had never told Elliot about my life on purpose. Not out of spite. Not out of revenge strategy. Not because I was waiting for a dramatic moment to reveal everything. I just genuinely had never felt the need to share it with him. Nora and I had talked about it years ago, when we first got married. She'd asked me reasonably why I didn't tell my family more. I tried to explain it the best I could. It wasn't that I was ashamed of anything. It wasn't even that I thought they wouldn't be happy for me. It was that Elliot had established himself from very early on as someone who got to decide what kind of life I was living. And I'd made a choice not to give him new material. Nora understood. She'd grown up with a sister who operated the same way. Not mean exactly, just someone for whom other people's lives were a ranking system. We'd built our own world deliberately. Our friends knew us. Abby's school knew us. Nora's colleagues knew our family. We weren't hiding. We just hadn't invited my brother in. What I hadn't anticipated was that Elliot would eventually need something from me. It was a Tuesday in February, about 6 weeks after Christmas, when he called. He didn't say hello the way people say hello when they're calling to catch up. He said it the way people say it when they've already rehearsed the conversation twice in the car. Hey, it's Elliot. I know, I said. There was a pause. You got a few minutes? I was in my office. Dwight had retired 4 years earlier, and I'd bought out his share, so the company was fully mine at that point. I had a good team, an office manager named Rita who handled everything I didn't have patience for, and more time than I'd had in years. Sure, I said. The story came out in pieces. The Clearwater franchise had run into trouble. The location was wrong. He'd picked a spot with too much competition and not enough foot traffic. He'd taken out a business loan to cover the build-out, put his house up as partial collateral, and now the franchise was losing money at a rate that he'd underestimated by a significant margin. He was 6 months behind on the loan. The franchisor was pressuring him, and he had about 60 days before the bank started making real noise. He needed $250,000. He said it like it was a specific amount he'd calculated, not a round number. That detail made me feel like he'd thought about it more carefully than he let on. Why are you calling me? I asked. I wasn't being cruel. I genuinely wanted to understand his logic. There was a long pause. Because you're the only one I know who might have it, he said. I called Dad. Well, Dad doesn't have that kind of money anymore. I've talked to 3 banks. The terms are brutal. I didn't know where else to go. I leaned back in my chair. Through my office window, I could see the parking lot and past that, the beginning of the office park we managed. 18 units, fully occupied, one of our first acquisitions. Elliot, I said, I need to tell you something. He waited. I'm not single. I've been married for 12 years. My wife's name is Nora. She's a real estate attorney. We have 2 kids, a daughter, Abby, she's 17, and a son, James, who's 14. We live in Dublin. I own a property management company. I have for about 16 years. The silence on the other end was the kind that has weight to it, not emptiness. Presence. What? He said. It wasn't a question. It was a word that fell out. I know you've been telling people I live alone and haven't figured things out. I'm telling you now that isn't accurate. Conrad. His voice had changed. Something had come out of it. Why have you never? Because you decided what my life was a long time ago, I said. And I decided I didn't need to argue with you about it. I'm not telling you now to make you feel bad. I'm telling you because you called me asking for a significant amount of money, and you deserve to understand who you're asking. Another long silence. I didn't know, he finally said. I know you didn't. We talked for another 40 minutes that night. He asked about Nora, asked about the kids, asked how long I'd been running the company. His voice was different through all of it, quieter, more careful, like someone navigating a floor they'd just realized wasn't solid. He apologized, several times, for Christmas specifically and then more generally, in the way people apologize when they realize the thing they're apologizing for is larger than they thought. I accepted it, not because I was over it. You don't unhear something said in front of 14 people over turkey, but because I've never found much use in holding on to grievances. They're expensive to carry. What I didn't do was say yes. I told him I needed to think about it. I told him to send me the actual paperwork, the loan documents, the franchise agreement, his current financials, the bank correspondence. I told him I wanted to see the real numbers before I said anything. He sent everything within an hour. I spent the next 2 days going through it with Nora. She sat beside me at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on, pulling up comparable market data on her laptop while I read through the loan terms. "He's not completely underwater," she said on the second night. "No," I agreed. "But the Clearwater location has to close. There's no version where that location works. Can he cover the loan if it closes?" "With help, maybe. If he restructures." We talked about it like the professional problem it was, which is what it needed to be. Not a family favor, not a punishment. Just a decision with real money involved. I called Elliot back on a Thursday morning. "I'm not giving you $250," I said. He went quiet. "I'm going to loan you $100,000 at 2% interest with a written agreement, a 5-year payoff schedule, and a clause that says if you miss more than 2 payments, it converts to an equity stake in your main Ohio operation. The rest is your problem to solve." "Conrad, I'm not done," I said. "The Clearwater location closes. That's not a preference, that's a condition. It's bleeding money, and it's going to drag everything else down with it. You know this. I know this. You close it, take the loss, renegotiate the franchise agreement to limit your liability, and then you focus on what you actually built, which is solid." He was quiet for a long time. I let him be quiet. "The Clearwater location," he finally said, "took me 2 years to get approved." "I know," I said. "And it was the wrong location. The numbers say so. I'm sorry." He didn't say anything. "Elliot, you built something real in Ohio. Your main 3 locations are profitable. Your staff retention is good. You have equity in a house that's worth considerably more than when you bought it. You made 1 bad call. That's it. Don't let it become 5 bad calls because your ego is wrapped up in Florida." Another silence. Then he said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." We had the loan document drawn up by the following week. Nora drafted it herself, which I appreciated not just because it saved legal fees, but because it was clean and clear and left no room for ambiguity. Elliot signed it without complaint. The Clearwater location closed in March. Elliot told our father about Nora and the kids before I could. My father called me a few days later on a Sunday afternoon. He didn't lead with the question everyone else would have led with. He just said, "I'd like to meet them. When's a good time?" I said, "Whenever you want, Dad." He came out in April. Spent 4 days. Nora made pot roast the first night because she'd asked me what he liked and I'd said he liked simple food, and she'd taken that seriously. He sat at our kitchen table and talked to Abby for 2 hours about her college plans. He and James spent an afternoon going through James's computer setup, which my father understood approximately none of, but nodded attentively through anyway. Before he left, he stood in the driveway for a moment and looked at the house. Just looked at it. "You built something," he said. I nodded. He got in his car and drove back to Dayton. That was that. Elliot called me in June, about 3 months after the loan closed. He'd made his first payment, early actually, a week ahead of the due date. We talked for a few minutes about the Ohio locations, how foot traffic had picked up with the spring season. He mentioned one of his managers had been there 8 years, which I noticed he said with a kind of quiet pride he hadn't used when talking about the Clearwater build-out. Before he hung up, he said, "I owe you more than the money." I let that sit there for a second. "You don't," I said, "but you're welcome." There was a pause where he might have said something more and then decided not to. I understood. Some things are better left at the edge of language. "Say hi to Nora," he finally said. "I will." "And the kids. Tell them their Uncle Elliot exists." "They know," I said. "I've been telling them about you." He laughed a little, a real laugh, not a performance of one. We hung up. I sat there in my office for a moment after the call ended, looking out through the window at the parking lot and the office park beyond it. It was a Tuesday afternoon in June. Warm, one of the maintenance guys was watering the planters by the main entrance, which was unnecessary since it had rained that morning. But it was a thing he did, and it was his way of caring for something. I watched him do it for a minute, then I turned back to my desk, pulled up the receivables report, and went back to work. That's the thing about a life built quietly. Nobody sees the construction. They only see what's standing when they finally look. I've never minded that. I minded the sneering, but the not looking, that never bothered me at all. I've thought a lot about why Elliot said what he said that Christmas, not to be angry about it. I worked through the anger on the drive home, alone in the car, watching the highway lights. I've thought about it because I think it explains something true about how people get themselves into trouble. Elliot was genuinely smart. He built something real. But somewhere along the way, he confused visibility with value. He'd spent so long measuring success by what other people could see, the house, the franchise locations, the dinner on the company card in Clearwater, that he stopped being able to evaluate things any other way, including me. I didn't post, I didn't brag, I didn't drive a car that announced anything. So in his system, I had nothing. It was a logical conclusion from a broken premise. The thing is, that same thinking is what got him into the Florida mess. He didn't buy the Clearwater location because the numbers were good. The numbers were never good. He bought it because it was something to point to. Another location. Another state. A story to tell at dinner. And when the story stopped being flattering, he was stuck with the debt. I don't say that to be harsh about my brother. I say it because I spent years quietly building something by asking a single question about every decision. Does this actually work, or does it just look like it works? It sounds simple. It isn't. There's constant pressure. From family, from culture, from the part of your own ego that wants to be recognized, to choose the thing that looks like it works. The franchise in a sunnier state over the quiet management company in central Ohio. The announcement over the result. What I learned slowly, over about 20 years of doing unglamorous work in an office that nobody visited, is that discipline isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel like strength in the moment. It feels like restraint in the moment. It feels like restraint. It feels like saying no to things that would have made good stories, and yes to things that made the actual numbers work. Nora understood this about me before I'd articulated it to myself. It's part of why I knew on that first night that she was someone I wanted to spend my life with. She had no interest in the performance of a thing. She wanted the thing itself. And the children piece? I think about this too. Abby and James grew up watching Nora and me make decisions based on what was real, not what looked good. They've never heard us brag about anything. They've also never seen us panic. I think there's a connection there. When you're not performing for an audience, you make cleaner decisions. You can see the actual situation more clearly because you're not also managing how it looks. The call Elliot made in February cost him something. I know that. It cost him the version of himself that got to be the successful younger brother who had it figured out. That version was built on a foundation that included me failing. And when that foundation turned out to be wrong, something had to be renegotiated. What I gave him wasn't grace, exactly. It was just clarity. Here's what's real. Here's what's salvageable. Here's what has to go. That's all any of us can offer someone when they're standing at the edge of a bad decision. They can't unmake. He made his first payment early. I noticed that. I didn't mention it when we talked, but I noticed it, and I thought, that's the beginning of something. Not a story. Just a man paying attention to what's real. That's enough.